Transcontinental Railroad workers, East Coast to West Coast. During most of the 1800s, people in the United States who wanted to travel from the East Coast to the West Coast had few choices. One option was to travel by sea, a route that took 3 to 6 months going around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. Traveling by ship had its hazards, including wind, storms, seasickness, and lack of drinkable water. This route had a shortcut, which went through the country of Panama. But because the Panama Canal had not yet been built, the route required a difficult land crossing. This journey had all the dangers of traveling by ship, plus additional perils, including diseases such as malaria and cholera. Another option for traveling from coast to coast in the 1800s was to ride in a stagecoach or covered wagon, spending 3 to 5 months on one of the immigrant trails: the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, the Mormon Trail, or the California Trail. This mode of transportation had hazards as well, including hail and lightning, accidents, and disease. There was also the threat of attack by Native Americans. During the 1850s, a man named Theodore Judah wanted to reduce the time and effort of traveling between the two coasts by building a transcontinental railroad that would span the entire country. Judah worked as a railroad surveyor. A surveyor is a person who examines and measures land for the purpose of building roads, railroads, and structures. One of the main obstacles with building a transcontinental railroad was constructing the lines through the mountain ranges that divided the country. Judah traveled to the Sierra Nevada mountains, which stretch across eastern California, to determine whether railroad tracks could be laid through these mountains. He was certain that it could be done, even though those around him were skeptical. Judah surveyed, calculated, and planned. His first goal was to convince others that laying tracks through the mountains was possible because, after all, he couldn't build a railroad by himself. At the time, the United States government was not interested in Judah's proposal to build a railroad, so he had to look elsewhere for funding. Malaria, a disease transmitted to humans when bitten by infectious mosquitoes. Cholera, a disease caused by consuming contaminated food or water. The Central Pacific Railroad. Theodore Judah looked in California for wealthy individuals who may want to invest in his endeavor of building the Transcontinental Railroad. He found 4 men who were interested: Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Leland Stanford, and Charles Crocker. These investors were known as the Big Four. They were wealthy men who were interested in replacing wagons and ships with railroads so that goods and merchandise could be delivered quickly from the East Coast. With rich investors to back Theodore, the Central Pacific Railroad was formed. After finding investors, Theodore Judah returned to Washington to seek government authorization and additional funding. He was able to convince Congress and Abraham Lincoln to pass the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. This act authorized 2 railroads, the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad, to construct the Transcontinental Railroad. The government agreed to pay the 2 railroads for each mile of track laid. More money was paid for the track laid through the mountains, $48,000 per mile, than for the track laid on the flat open plain, $16,000 per mile. Land grants were also authorized. Each railroad received 6,400 acres for every mile of track that it laid. A meeting point of the 2 railroads was not designated in the Railroad Act. The Central Pacific Railroad began construction in Sacramento, California in 1863, and almost immediately Theodore Judah regretted his choice of investors. The Big Four were making decisions without consulting Judah, and he questioned their judgment. None of them were railroad men or engineers, and it appeared that they were trying to take away some of his authority. Judah decided to go to New York to find new investors. Unfortunately, while traveling through Panama on his way back to New York, Judah became ill and died after contracting yellow fever, similar to malaria. Sadly, Judah never got to see the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Union Pacific Railroad. A decision was made that the Transcontinental Railroad would run through the center of the United States and that the western terminus, or end of the line, would be Sacramento, California. The location of the eastern terminus, however, was not clear. Cities in Kansas and Missouri were considered, but ultimately it was determined that Omaha, Nebraska would be the eastern terminus. Council Bluffs, Iowa, is directly across the Missouri River from Omaha, and therefore it is occasionally referred to as the eastern terminus. The Union Pacific Railroad broke ground at the end of 1863. However, because the Civil War was still being fought, it was difficult to find enough workers. For 2 years, the Union Pacific Railroad struggled to make progress, partially because of the lack of labor, but also because of a greedy, dishonest executive. The controlling partner of the Union Pacific Railroad, Thomas C. Durant, was scheming to make money by laying more track than was necessary. Knowing that the Union Pacific was paid by the mile, Durant spent the first 2 years laying miles and miles of unnecessary track, never extending more than 40 miles beyond Omaha. He was not concerned with connecting to the Central Pacific Railroad. His only motivation was greed. Everything changed with the end of the Civil War. First, many ex-soldiers and former slaves were looking for work. This put an end to the labor shortage. Additionally, the government now had the resources to oversee the construction of the railroad. At last, the Union Pacific Railroad began to make some progress. Initially, the meeting point of the two railroads was not designated. They were to meet somewhere in the Midwest. Both railroads were greedy, and each tried to acquire as much money as many acres as they could. This caused a competitive approach between the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads. Perhaps the government did not realize that there could be problems with this tactic. As each company pushed its employees to work rapidly, no one seemed to care whether the track was laid properly, as long as it was laid quickly. In many instances, tracks were put down over snow and ice, which would eventually melt, causing the tracks to buckle. When the lines were ultimately connected, repairs were required almost immediately. All in a day's work. Building the railroad in the 1800s was no easy feat. There were no motorized machines to do the heavy, back-breaking labor. Workers toiled with pickaxes, hammers, and shovels. They carried away the dirt in buckets. They broke up rocks, dug out trees and stumps, and hauled them away. They graded the roadway, laid down the ties, and spiked the rails. Bridges were built over rivers and streams, and rocks were blasted away to create tunnels through the rugged mountains. Those men working on the Central Pacific Railroad endured the severe winter weather and freezing temperatures through the Sierra Nevada mountain range. One difficulty that workers encountered was keeping the roadway clear of snow. In 1867 alone, there were over 40 snowstorms. Avalanches occurred as well, undoing progress and taking lives. Officials knew that if heavy snowfall and avalanches prevented laying the tracks, they would also prevent trains from traveling on the tracks. The solution to build the permanent snow sheds, also called snow galleries, to protect tracks and workers from the snow. These structures were built over tracks and were constructed to withhold the weight of a heavy snowfall or an avalanche. In all, over 37 miles of snow sheds were built. Building a railroad had its hazards. Workers on the Central Pacific Railroad had to lay tracks through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Tunneling through the mountains was a slow process. Suspended by ropes, a man would be lowered in a basket over sheer mountainsides. After manually drilling holes for the explosions, black powder would be used to blast away solid granite. In 1867, nitroglycerin replaced the black powder, speeding up the process but not reducing the danger. The Native Americans presented another potential risk. There were many raids by tribes against the Iron Horse that invaded their territory. Through the plains, the Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapaho tribes aggressively attempted to stop construction by destroying tracks and killing workers. Assaults increased, and in fact, 1865 was known as the Bloody Year on the Plains due to the attacks by tribes. The attacks became so severe that eventually the military was brought in and forts were established to protect the workers and rails. In time, many of the attacks by the Native Americans were not only against the construction of the railroad, but were also in retaliation for brutal assaults by American troops. Violent encounters became so frequent that eventually all of the workers on the Union Pacific Railroad were armed and ready to defend themselves. Life on the job. Working on the railroad was not like having a traditional job. The workers lived away from their homes, living in temporary housing that was set up near the point of construction. These base camps occasionally became permanent towns when workers were housed for a longer period of time. In these cases, the town survived even when the workers moved on. For example, North Platte, Nebraska, grew when there were difficulties and delays in building a particular bridge near North Platte. Green River, Utah also experienced delays, and as a result, grew into an established town. However, many towns settled temporarily, then vanished when the workers left. A town might be thriving 1 month, with stores, housing, and restaurants, and then be completely gone the next month. In some cases, even the houses would be disassembled and brought to the next settlement where they would be reassembled. Additionally, the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads both made use of the train cars as a housing option. Workers would sleep in bunks that were built into the cars. They also took their meals there. This housing option proved very convenient on the plains when the tracks were laid quickly and the base camps moved frequently. The work itself was very strenuous. After the surveyors and engineers determined where the tracks would go, laborers prepared the roadbed, the foundation on which the tracks would be laid. This was done by smoothing the ground and making it level. Ties, the wooden supports, would be put down and then the rails would be laid on the ties. Finally, a spike would be driven through a hole in the rail and into the tie. In addition to the laborers who were busy building the lines, there were also cooks, water carriers, bridge engineers, loggers, clerks, and many others who contributed to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Who were the workers, Central Pacific Railroad? Thousands of men worked tirelessly in their efforts to complete the first Transcontinental Railroad. Former Civil War soldiers, freed slaves, Irish and Chinese immigrants, and Mormon men made up most of the workforce. Women were not hired to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Around the middle of the 1800s, many Chinese began immigrating to the United States, specifically to California. They were aware of the discovery of gold, and they came seeking their fortunes. At the time, China was experiencing extreme poverty and civil unrest. Most of these immigrants were family men who wanted to come to America, work for a while, and return to China with most of the money that they had earned. When construction began on the Central Pacific Railroad, there was a serious shortage of workers. Irish immigrants had been employed, but they were threatening to strike over wages. Officials of the Central Pacific Railroad reluctantly decided to try hiring Chinese immigrants to fill the deficiency. Some executives were skeptical about the Chinese immigrants' ability to do the physical labor. However, Charles Crocker, one of the Big Four, was optimistic, as is reflected in his infamous quote, "Did they not build the Chinese wall, the biggest piece of masonry in the world?" Very soon, the Chinese immigrants earned a reputation for being hardworking, quick learners, and productive, as well as peaceful and respectful. The executives were so pleased with the immigrants' work that within a few years, 80 to 90% of the workers were Chinese immigrants. Even though executives were satisfied with the work performed by the Chinese, they often discriminated against them. For example, other employees were consistently paid better than their Chinese counterparts. Chinese immigrants received wages of $27 to $30 a month. The other employees received wages of $35 per month. They both worked 12 hours a day. Chinese immigrants provided their food. The other employees' food was provided by the railroad. Chinese immigrants paid for their shelter. Other employees' shelter was furnished by the railroad. Who were the workers? Union Pacific Railroad. Like the Central Pacific Railroad, the Union Pacific had a difficult time securing enough workers. The United States was in the midst of the Civil War when the Union Pacific broke ground in December 1863. For over a year, they struggled with their labor shortage. That changed when the Civil War ended and thousands of former soldiers and freed slaves were looking for work. In addition to these men, there were thousands of Irish immigrants who had come from Ireland looking for a better way of life. These men arrived in the United States with little money and were desperate for employment. Most of the employees began working for the railroad with no real building or engineering skills. Brigham Young, the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church, wanted the railroad to come through Utah. Years earlier, 60,000 Mormons had settled in what would become Utah Territory, and Brigham Young knew that the railroad would make it easier to bring members west. Young arranged with railroad executives of both railroads to hire members of the Mormon Church to lay tracks through Utah. It was said that the work done by the Mormons was some of the best on the line. Unfortunately, the Union Pacific Railroad executive officers were not the most honest or generous men. When it came time to pay Brigham Young and his workers, Thomas C. Durant and the other executives intentionally underpaid the Mormons, and instead they pocketed the money themselves. Young ended up taking the officers to court, and even though he won his case, he never did receive the full compensation that he was promised. When the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads ultimately met, it was at Promontory Summit, Utah. Brigham Young, frustrated with the executives, did not attend the celebration. Promontory Summit. On May 10, 1869, the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad met in Utah at a location called Promontory Summit. The connection of these two lines created the first Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. After years of planning, surveying, digging, blasting, building, and generally performing hard labor, the final tracks were laid. Plans had been made for a big event. The ceremony was to take place on May 8, 1869. However, rain and mud caused the celebration to be postponed. Additionally, Thomas C. Durant, the deceitful executive of the Union Pacific Railroad, was held up by unpaid workers blocking the line and demanding payment. The ceremony was delayed until May 10th. The actual ceremony was somewhat disorganized. While some thought as many as 10,000 people would be present for the event, it is estimated that only 500 to 1,000 spectators were in attendance. One locomotive from each railroad faced each other on the track. There were several final spikes, which were each driven into the railroad tie for the purpose of taking ceremonial pictures. After each picture, the spike would be removed and the pictures would be taken with the next final spike. The most well-known final spike is a golden spike with May 8, 1869 engraved on it, which, of course, turned out to be the incorrect date. This gold spike was put into a museum at Stanford University in 1862, where it can still be seen today. However, even this was not the final spike, since following photographs, the gold spike was immediately removed and an iron spike was put in its place. Laying the tracks began in 1863 and was completed in 1869. Although numerous repairs were required, transcontinental journeys began almost immediately. There were several benefits to the railroad's completion. The cross-country travel time was reduced to 1 week. The dangers of traveling by ship or stagecoach were no longer a concern, and goods and merchandise could be easily shipped between the coasts. Most importantly, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad promoted the settlement of the West.